In 1943, people were dying on the streets of Calcutta in front of shops that had food in them. Not because the shops were closed, not because the city had been bombed or blockaded, because the price of rice had risen so far beyond what a Bengali farm worker could earn that grain sat behind glass while the people who grew it collapsed on the pavement outside. That detail, food present, people starving, is the key to understanding what happened in Bengal in 1943. It is also the detail the British government spent years trying to obscure. Between 2 and 3 million people died. The numbers were disputed from the moment the famine ended, and the dispute is part of the story because the British government controlled who counted and what they were allowed to conclude. What is not disputed, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who was 9 years old in Calcutta in 1943 would spend 40 years demonstrating with mathematical precision that there was no food shortage. The famine that killed millions happened in a year when Bengal had enough food to feed its population. What it didn't have was a government that considered feeding it a priority. To understand how this happened, follow the decisions backward. Start in May 1942. The Japanese had taken Burma. Fearing invasion, military planners ordered the boat denial policy, confiscating any vessel large enough to carry 10 or more passengers from Bengal's coastal districts. Approximately 45,000 boats were seized or destroyed. They were not leisure craft. They were how fishermen fed their families and how rice moved along the river networks connecting Bengal's economy. A British civil servant who administered the policy told the subsequent famine inquiry it had completely broken the economy of the fishing class. That testimony is in the record. It was filed and set aside. Alongside the boats, soldiers confiscated and in some cases destroyed rice stocks in coastal areas so they could not supply a hypothetical Japanese invader. Thousands of tons were removed from communities that would be hungry within the year. Some of it was thrown into rivers. Bicycles, bullock carts, and elephants were requisitioned too. Everything that moved food through Bengal was taken or destroyed in anticipation of an enemy that never arrived. Then Bengal continued exporting rice to Ceylon for months after these policies began, even as early signs of a crisis appeared in provincial markets. The result, as Amartya Sen demonstrated, was not a shortage of food in the aggregate. It was a dismantling of the mechanisms by which people accessed food, combined with wartime inflation that pushed rice prices beyond what the rural poor could pay. People starved not because Bengal had no rice. They starved because the system that allowed them to claim food had been destroyed by the people governing them. Now trace what happened in London. Beginning in December 1942, requests arrived at the War Cabinet. The Governor of Bengal, the Viceroy, General Auchinleck, Admiral Mountbatten, Leo Amery, Secretary of State for India. One after another they requested food imports. One after another, those requests were rejected or cut to a fraction of the original amounts. The colony was not permitted to use its own sterling reserves to import food, not permitted to use its own ships. Leo Amery kept a diary. It is held at Churchill College, Cambridge. What it records is a War Cabinet meeting on August 4, 1943, by which point people were already dying in Calcutta's streets, at which Amery urged the cabinet to act. Churchill's response, as Amery recorded it, was a preliminary flourish on Indians breeding like rabbits. The request was denied. The War Cabinet recommended what its minutes described as forceful propaganda and curbs on inflation as its answer to mass starvation. Amery tried again. After another rebuff, he recorded that Churchill may be right that the starvation of underfed Bengalis is less serious than sturdy Greeks from the war point of view, but makes no sufficient allowance for empire responsibility. Amery was the man arguing hardest inside that room. Even he had absorbed the cabinet's hierarchy of whose starvation mattered. By September 1943, when the War Cabinet finally acknowledged the scale of the famine, between 1 and 2 million people had already died. The strongest case for the defense deserves to be stated plainly. The War Cabinet was fighting a world war. Shipping was being sunk at roughly 1 vessel per day. Aid did eventually arrive. Over 1 million tons of grain reached Bengal between August 1943 and end of 1944. Churchill appointed Field Marshal Wavell as viceroy in October 1943, and Wavell deployed the army to move food from surplus to deficit areas. His defenders argue this broke the famine. They are right, and it still does not resolve the central question. Because in August 1943, the same month Amory pleaded for relief, shipping records show Australian wheat traveling to Ceylon, the Middle East, and South Africa, everywhere in the Indian Ocean except India. Historian Madhusree Mukherjee, who spent years in those archives, called the assignments a will to punish. That is her conclusion, but the assignments are in the record. The United States offered grain on American ships. The offer was not followed up. Canada proposed 100,000 tons of wheat. The War Cabinet vetoed it. Wavell himself recorded that the Churchill government's attitude to India was negligent, contemptuous, and hostile. The Woodhead Commission reported in 1945 its members were forbidden from taking personal notes. It used projected rather than actual data on rice availability. It largely exonerated London. The Indian members immediately denounced it as a whitewash. Their objections are in the record and have received a fraction of the attention given to the Commission's findings. In Churchill's 6-volume account of the war, the Bengal famine does not appear. Not a chapter, not a paragraph, not a sentence. A man who wrote with forensic detail about North Africa and Normandy found no space across 4,000 pages for the deaths of millions he governed in Bengal. Amartya Sen observed that famine has never occurred in a functioning democracy because democratic governments are accountable to the people who die in them. Bengal's population did not vote in British elections. The decision calculus reflected it. The British government has never formally apologized. In 2010, Gordon Brown apologized for forced deportation of children to Australia. In 2013, William Hague apologized for torturing Kenyans during the Mau Mau uprising. The language has been available when governments chose to use it. For Bengal, it has not been chosen. In 2019, a study in Geophysical Research Letters analyzed soil moisture across 6 major Indian famines between 1873 and 1943. 5 of them were linked to drought. The 6th, Bengal, 1943, showed above normal rainfall, no crop failure, no drought, the only famine in 70 years that cannot be explained by the climate. The scientists concluded it was caused by policy. The record had been saying the same thing since 1943. 3 million people died in front of food they could not afford to buy, in a country supplying Britain's war effort with cotton, labor, and soldiers, not permitted to use its own money or ships to feed itself. Churchill wrote after the war that the peoples of Hindustan had been carried through the conflict on the shoulders of Britain's small island. He wrote it knowing what was in Amory's diary. He wrote it having decided that 6 volumes of wartime memoir would contain no mention of Bengal. He wrote it, as Shashi Tharoor observed, because he intended to write history himself. For a very long time, he succeeded.